Welcome to week 5 class. This week we're going to be covering chapters 11, which is all about personality psychology, chapter 12, which is all about social psychology. We'll be skipping chapter 13 and going right on to chapter 14, which will talk about stress, lifestyle, and health. You'll also have a lecture in this week as well for you to discuss, and obviously your chapter questions are due on Sunday by midnight. Let's get started with chapter 11. So chapter 11 is all about personality psychology. This chapter aims to answer the question, what is personality? What makes two individuals have different personalities? Personality is defined as the long-standing traits and patterns that propel individuals to consistently think, feel, and behave in specific ways. It comes from the Latin word persona, which, defined, actually means a mask worn by an actor. In ancient times, theatrical masks were used to represent/project a specific personality trait. You can see here happy, sad, impatient, shy, fear-filled, curious, and helpful. What characteristics describe your personality? To what extent is a person's personality truly unique? How much do our personalities overlap with those of others? How consistent or inconsistent is our behavior across time and across situations? How much of a role does biology or experience play in our developing our personalities? Is the basic nature of humans good or bad? All throughout history, personality psychologists aim to answer some of those big questions. And many of you at the beginning of this summer session asked some of those big questions in that first group of questions when I said, what is a big question that you're hoping this class can answer for you? Some of the historical perspectives date back to the ancient philosophy times. So personality was studied as early as the very beginning of time. When you began studying psychology, personality psychology was right there. Hippocrates in 370 BCE theorized that personality traits and human behaviors are based on 4 separate temperaments associated with 4 fluids, also known as humors of the body. These 4 humors of the body were given colors, basically. You had the choleric humor. This was yellow bile from the liver. The melancholic humor, which is black bile from the kidneys. And sanguine, red blood from the heart. And phlegmatic, which is white phlegm from the lungs. So you had yellow, black, red, and white. Now, obviously, this sounds a little bit bizarre, right? Sounds weird. Galen then capitalized a little bit on that and believed both diseases and personality differences could be explained by imbalances in these 4 humors, and that each person exhibits one of the 4 temperaments. This became the prevalent view for how psychologists viewed personality for over 1,000 years through the Middle Ages. And they categorized each of those 4 humors with specific characteristics. So they took the choleric one, and that became passion, ambition, and boldness. Melancholic became reserved, anxious, and unhappy. Sanguine was joyful, eager, and optimistic. And phlegmatic was calm, reliable, and thoughtful. If we consider on, or continue on rather, Franz Gall in 1780 looked at it historically from what was called a phrenology standpoint. He proposed that the distances between bumps on the skull reveal a person's personality traits, character, and mental abilities. So they stopped looking at these 4 liquids in the body, but rather started looking at the brain. And I'm not talking about the different areas of the brain, but rather the skull specifically. This, of course, was discredited for lack of empirical support. Gall developed a chart that depicted which areas of the skull corresponded to particular personality traits or characteristics. You can see that in image A if you zoom in. That each one of the areas of the skull, if it had any bumps in those areas, it revealed a specific personality trait. And in image B, you can see an 1825 lithograph depicts Gall examining the skull of a young woman. Now, like stated, this was clearly discredited for lack of empirical support. How are we to know that this is really true? Gall could have been asking the folks that he was actually examining the skulls of things prior to. Who's to say? Then in the 18th century, Immanuel Kant agreed with Galen. So we're going back to those four humors and the four temperaments. Agreed that individuals could be categorized into one of four temperaments. Then developed a list of traits to describe the personality of each of the four temperaments. Then in the 19th century, you have Wilhelm Wundt. Now, Wilhelm suggested that personality could be described using two major axes. The emotional and non-emotional axis, which runs horizontally, or vertically, and the horizontal axis is changeable and unchangeable. So if we take the four temperaments that Kant broke up, that were first discovered by Galen and Hippocrates, you've got the melancholic area, the choleric area, the sanguine area, and the phlegmatic area. Then on top of that, you overlay Wundt's two major axes, the emotional and the non-emotional, and then the changeable and the unchangeable. Above the axes in the strong emotions are strong emotions. These are the melancholic and choleric emotions. So if someone falls into the melancholic or the choleric area, anxious, worry, unhappy, suspicious, excitable, exhibitionist, impulsive, these are strong emotions. You can likely tell when someone is exhibiting that. That's what makes them strong. You tend to see them displayed. But phlegmatic and sanguine, those are weaker emotions, reasonable, principled, controlled. They might be playful and easygoing and sociable. Yes, you might see those on the outside, but they're not quite as out there. They're not as loud as the emotions of the melancholic and choleric, or the characteristics. Then on the horizontal axis, you have changeable and unchangeable. Choleric and sanguine, those are changeable temperaments, meaning that they don't stay that way forever. They can adjust themselves. However, if they fall into the melancholic or phlegmatic temperament categories, these are unchangeable temperaments. Someone who is reasonable and principled and controlled tends to remain that way and doesn't change all that much. Sadly, that also means that the unhappiness, the serious, the thoughtful, the worried, and the anxious do tend to remain that way. It can be difficult to switch gears. Now, this, of course, was all according to Wilhelm Wundt in the 19th century. Then in the 20th century, in pops Freud, everyone's favorite psychodynamic perspective. He was the first comprehensive theory of personality explaining both normal and abnormal behaviors. He proposed that unconscious drives influenced sex, aggression, and childhood sexuality influenced our personality, which obviously made a lot of people sort of gasp. It's a weird one. More New Age Freudians, so people who are a little bit more hip and modern, agreed that childhood experiences do matter, but they placed a lot less emphasis on sex. They focused on the social environment and effects of culture on personality. Now, Freud, because he thought so much about consciousness, specifically the unconscious mind, which is our mental activity that we are unaware of and are unable to access, He developed this sort of diagram of our conscious and unconscious minds. He believed that we are only aware of a small amount, like 1/10 of our mind's activities, and most of it remains hidden from us in our unconscious. Using this picture of the iceberg, what you see above the surface of the water is what we're aware of. These are our mind's activities that we are aware of. Below the surface is our unconscious mind. And he split our icebergs into 3 different distinct areas, known as the superego, the ego, and the id. He believed that unacceptable urges and desires are kept in our unconscious through repression. We are repressing those areas. He also believed that the information in our unconscious affects our behavior, although we are unaware of it. He coined the term Freudian slip and suggested that slips of the tongue, saying a word that you did not intend to say, are sexual/aggressive urges accidentally slipping out of our unconscious, making their way above the surface. If we split those 3 areas of the iceberg up and reveal that Freud posited that personality results from efforts to balance 2 competing forces. The first force is the biological, aggressive, and pleasure-seeking drives. And the second is the internal, our socialized control over these pleasure-seeking drives. So our biology is constantly trying to seek pleasure and act aggressively. But our internal, socialized control, what we've learned from our environment that tells us that's not such a good idea, are constantly trying to balance each other out and work against each other. And he described this process as an interaction between the 3 systems. First of those 3 systems is the id. This is where our primitive urges are. Our urge for hunger, thirst, and sex. These are impulsive and instinctual. And it operates on the pleasure principle of seeking immediate gratification. The second area is the superego. The superego develops through interactions with others. This is where you learn social roles and rules for right and wrong. Think of it like your moral compass. Tells you what you can and cannot do based upon the roles and rules. The superego, however, does strive for perfection. It needs to be the best. It's got to be the greatest. This is what's judging your behavior. This is what ends up leading you to feeling feelings of pride or guilt or shame. The way it's best to depict the id and the superego is, have you ever watched a cartoon and a person is really trying to decide between making a good moral decision and a bad decision? But that bad decision is just going to make them feel really good. So there's some motivation to make the bad decision. So on their shoulders, they show a little devil kind of trying to talk them into making the bad decision because it will please them to do so. And on the other shoulder is the angel saying, that's not right. That would be breaking rules. You shouldn't do that in order to be considered a good person. Think of the id like little devil on your shoulder and the superego like little angel on your shoulder when it comes to making tough decisions. Now, the ego is the self. This is you trying to attempt to balance the id and the superego. This is the rational part of you. It can make logical reasoning between those 2 different areas, understanding what the id needs, but also what the superego is striving for. This operates on the reality principle. It helps the id satisfy desires in a more realistic way. How can I make a decision that's almost like a compromise? Satisfying the id, but making sure not to feel any guilt if I make the wrong move. And this is the part of the personality that others see. So others see your ego, your sense of self. Now, people could really get behind this. and its effects on personality. If you have a balanced id and superego, you might display a healthy personality. But if your id and superego are imbalanced, this might develop into a neuroses, a tendency to experience negative emotions, anxiety disorders, and unhealthy behaviors. If there isn't a balance there, right? If your superego is really big and kind of taking over, then they're not really seeking any pleasure. The pleasure isn't gaining anything. All you're getting out of it is this strive for perfection. So anxiety could potentially display in that case. Now, Freud was also well known for creating these defense mechanisms. They were unconscious protective behaviors that work to reduce our anxiety. So when there's an imbalance in your ego, in your id and superego, we might have some defense mechanisms to help reduce the anxiety that comes about because there's an imbalance there. The ego uses these defense mechanisms to restore balance between these two areas. Freud believed them to be used by everyone, but that overuse could become problematic. The first defense mechanism is denial. This is refusing to accept real events because they are unpleasant. The example given is that Kayla refuses to admit she has an alcohol problem, although she is unable to do a single day without drinking excessively. She is denying what's actually happening as a way to create some balance and not feel any shame or guilt. Displacement is transferring inappropriate urges or behaviors onto a more acceptable or less threatening target. During lunch at a restaurant, Mark is angry at his older brother, but does not express it, and instead is verbally abusive to the server. We displace negative emotions onto others instead of placing them on the people that we really truly believe deserve them. Protection is attributing unacceptable desires to others. Chris often cheats on her boyfriend because she suspects he's already cheating on her. I'm going to project onto you what I believe is actually happening. Or I'm going to project onto you what I believe that you're doing when really, in essence, I'm only doing it. I'm the only one behaving that way. Rationalization is justifying behaviors by substituting acceptable reasons for less acceptable real reasons. Kim failed his history course because he did not study or attend class, but he told his roommates that he failed because the professor didn't like him. It had nothing to do with him not being prepared. Reaction formation is reducing anxiety by adopting beliefs contrary to your own beliefs. Nadia is angry with her coworker, Beth, for always arriving late to work after a night of partying. But she is nice and agreeable to Beth and affirms that partying is cool. Regression is returning to coping strategies for less mature stages of development. So after failing to pass his doctoral examination, Giorgio spends days in bed, cuddling his favorite childhood toy. Repression is suppressing painful memories and thoughts. Lachey cannot remember her grandfather's fatal heart attack, although she was present for it. She repressed that because it was painful and she didn't want to remember it. Sublimation is redirecting unacceptable desires through socially acceptable channels. So Jerome's desire for revenge on the drunk driver who killed his son is channeled into a community support group for people who've lost loved ones to drunk driving. Now, obviously, some defense mechanisms aren't all that healthy, but some defense mechanisms are. Obviously, the example given for sublimation is a great one, turning a sad and tragic event into a helpful community organization can be a great way to handle and manage your grief. But projection might not be the best way to rectify unacceptable desires. Freud also was responsible for creating these stages of psychosocial sexual development. We briefly covered these in our lifespan development, but now we're going to go through them in far more depth, and you're going to probably think, oh my Lord in heaven, good God, what was he thinking? And you'll understand exactly why Neo-Freudians kind of flip the switch a little bit on what Freud originally theorized. He believed that children pass through 5 psychosexual stages. In each stage, the pleasure-seeking urges, your id, are focused on a different erogenous zone or part of the body. The lack of proper nurturing and parenting during these particular conflicting stages results in a person becoming fixated in that stage or stuck in that stage. So in the first stage of psychosexual development, which is the oral stage, which runs from birth to a year, the erogenous zone during this time is mouth. Pleasure comes from eating and sucking. The major conflict is being weaned from a bottle or breast, according to Freud. The adult fixation, if the major conflict occurs in that time and there isn't proper nurturing or parenting during the conflict of weaning from a bottle or breast, the fixation in adults is what develops smoking habits, overeating habits, and nail biting. I can kind of see it. Then we get to the anal stage. This is from 1 to 3 years. The erogenous zone at this time is the anus. Pleasure comes from bowel and bladder movements, and the major conflict is toilet training, right? 1 to 3 years is just around the time that potty training is occurring. And if proper nurturing and parenting occurs during this time, then everyone has a normal personality development later in life. If it doesn't go according to plan, then the adult fixation later in life creates anal retentive personality, means they could be stingy and stubborn and need for order and neatness. Someone might call you anal retentive, and this is what they're actually saying. Then there's anal expulsive personality, meaning messy and careless, disorganized, and prone to emotional outbursts. This is where people started to think, are you sure, Sigmund? This sounds a little bit bizarre. Then the phallic stage occurs from 3 to 6 years. The erogenous zone at this time is the genitals. And the major conflict is that the child feels a desire for the opposite sex parent. So male children feel a desire for their mother, and female children feel a sexual desire or a desire for their father. And jealousy and hatred towards the same-sex parent occurs. This is where you begin to see the Oedipus complex in boys and the electric complex in girls. The Oedipus complex in boys, excuse me, means that they desire their mother's attention and they urge to replace their father, meaning they want to be their father. They're afraid of being punished by father for these feelings. So they have what's called castration anxiety. The electric complexes in girls is the desire for father's attention, the urge to replace their mother, and they're angry at their mother for not providing them with a penis. They would prefer to have one. If they get fixated in a stage and it's not handled appropriately by the parents, the fixation later on as an adult becomes vanity or overambition. And it was really the phallic stage when people started to be like, whoa, definitely not what I would have expected. The latency stage is 6 to 12 years. And the reason it's called the latency stage is because it's pretty latent. Ain't nothing going on. There is no erogenous zone. And sexual feelings are dormant as children focus on school, friendships, hobbies, and engage with peers of the same sex. So you're beginning to form social bonds with others. You're beginning to create groups of friends and communities. You might be doing, activities and hobbies and things like that. Then, from 12 on, you've got the genital stage. The erogenous zone at this point is once again the genitals. So both phallic and genital stage have the same erogenous zone. They just call them different things. And this is 12 on. So as soon as you hit 12, Freud was like, okay, that's it. You've fully developed personality-wise at the age of 12. And according to Freud, this is when sexual reawakening occurs. Urges are redirected from parents to more socially acceptable partners, which, sure, maybe not quite at the age of 12, maybe around the ages of 13, 14, 15. But you can't honestly believe that your personality is fully developed at the age of 12. And that's it. That's who you'll be forever. This is when other personality psychologists started to step in and say, sure. In come Alfred Adler. He believed in individual psychology. Freud grouped everyone together, and everyone went through these particular stages. Not in Adler's case. According to Adler, there was a focus on our drive to compensate for feelings of inferiority. He was the one that created inferiority complex, a person's feelings that they lack worth and don't measure up to the standards of others or of society. He believed that social motives, thought to be the force behind our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, placed focus on social connections during childhood development, believed happiness can be found in working together for the betterment of all, and viewed the main goal of psychology to be to recognize the equal rights and equality of others. Adler saw conscious processes as more important rather than these specific stages that Freud had developed. He theorized that birth order shapes our personality. I love that someone's talking about birth order when it comes to our personality. Think about your own birth order. Do you have a personality that's shaped by the fact that you may be an only child, or the youngest of multiple children, or the oldest of multiple children? How does your birth order affect who you've become as a person? Adler then identified 3 fundamental social tasks all individuals must experience. We all must experience occupational tasks, careers, in order to create our personality. Societal tasks, friendships, relationships with others. And love tasks, finding an intimate partner. After Adler, we get introduced to Erik Erikson. Now, Erikson was also part of our theories of development, but he was the creator of the psychosocial theories of development. He believed that personality develops through the lifespan, right? Freud said, you're done at 12. Erikson said, yeah, I don't think so. I'm pretty sure it continues on. He placed less importance on our childhood and sexual and aggression, and more emphasis on social relationships at each stage of our lives. He believed that the development of a healthy personality and sense of competence depends on successfully completing each of the 8 stages that he theorized. His theories can be found in Chapter 9 in Lifespan Development, should you wish to review them. Now, Carl Jung also was an analytical psychologist, kind of similar to Freud, but not quite so aggressive and kind of scary. He focused on working to balance conscious and unconscious thought. So he too agreed that there was an imbalance between our conscious and unconscious thought. But he acknowledged the concept of a personal unconscious, but was also interested in exploring the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious was a universal version of personal unconscious, holding mental patterns or memory traces which are common to all of us. So archetypes, patterns that exist in our collective unconscious across cultures and societies. This is represented by universal themes in various cultures reflecting common experiences of people around the world. Integration of unconscious archetypal aspects of the self seen as part of self-realization processes. So archetypes were important for us to recommend or recognize in how we shape what our personalities are. We have archetypes or patterns, all of us, about specific cultural and societal norms. Universal themes reflecting common experiences of people around the world. So there's common experiences of weddings and falling in love and getting hired at a job and finding success and, getting to the next step in life. There are archetypes. He also coined the term, he also began using persona, right? The original term for where personality psychology came from. He talked a lot about a mask that we consciously adopt, okay? He believed that this was derived from conscious experiences and our collective unconscious. It was a compromise between our true self and the self that society expects us to be, hiding parts of the self that do not align with society's expectation. This was what he believed was our persona. He did believe that we wore masks. Now, Carl Jung also contributed really mainly to personality psychology by talking about and explaining extroversion and introversion as an idea between attitudes in life. And this is actually your very first question for your Chapter 11 questions. It's going to ask you to explain the differences between extroversion and introversion, which you can see here in this chart, more specifically energizing to both. What energizes each of these two groups? Okay, and you can see that right at the top of this chart. So introverts are energized by being alone. They avoid attention. They speak softly and slowly. They also think before speaking. They have a filter, so to speak. They tend to stay on topic and prefer written communication. So these are your friends that might email or text you. And they pay attention easily, and they're cautious. Extroverts, however, are energized by being with others. They seek attention. They speak quickly and loudly. They think out loud. They jump from topic to topic and prefer verbal communication. Your extroverted friends might be the ones that actually call you on the phone. They're distractible, and they act first and think later. This big personality trait was one that people started to recognize as being kind of the first identifier. And oftentimes when people ask you who you are, how do you identify? This particular trait is one that people jump to first. I'm extroverted or I'm introverted. They think this one single trait kind of blanketly explains who they are. And it's a pertinent topic to talk about. From that, we've got Karen Horney. Now, she agreed with Jung that individuals have the potential for self-realization and believed the goal of psychoanalysis should be moving toward a healthier self, but disagreed with the idea of penis envy that Freud had talked about and suggested that any jealousy is really culturally based. Differences in personality between men and women is culturally based. Men have womb envy because they cannot give birth, just as much as women have penis envy. Many of Horney's theories focused on unconscious anxiety. Normal growth can be blocked by basic anxiety stemming from needs that are not being met. 3 styles of coping used by children to relieve anxiety. Moving towards people. This is when they have affiliation and dependence. As adults, they're likely to have an intense need for love and acceptance. So if as children they move toward people to try and find affiliation and dependence on others in order to relieve their anxiety, as adults, they're more likely to have an intense need for love and acceptance in order to relieve their anxiety. They'll need validation from others. As a child, if someone moves against people in order to relieve their anxiety, they're going to show aggression and assertiveness. And as adults, they're likely to lash out and exploit others. And then as a child, if they move away people to relieve anxiety, show detachment and isolation. As adults, they're likely to avoid love and friendship and avoid interactions with others in order to relieve their anxiety. Now, if we switch gears and look at it from a behavioral perspective, we lean on Skinner. Okay? Learning approaches to personality focus on observable and measurable phenomena. All of Freud's theory was based upon the unconscious mind, the id, the ego, or the id and the superego, which was very much hidden from our world. Skinner and behavioral perspective psychologists believed that personality focused on observable and measurable phenomena. Skinner believed that we learn to behave in particular ways, and our personality is shaped by reinforcements and consequences in our environment. He believed that personality develops over our entire lifetime. Freud believed it stopped right at the age of 12, whereas Skinner believed it continued. Personality also can vary as we experience new situations. Freud believed that it was pretty singular and didn't change. Now, question 3 is all about this. This chapter goes a little bit out of order, okay? So question 3 is all about comparing and contrasting Freud and Skinner's perspective of personality. Write out what the difference is between these two theorists, okay? Now, Bandura, he came at it from a social cognitive perspective. He agreed that personality develops through learning, but disagreed with the behaviorist approach because thinking and reasoning are important parts of learning. He created the social cognitive theory to personality, emphasizing both learning, like Skinner, but then also adding cognition as sources of individual differences in our personality. He believed that reciprocal determinism was a factor in personality development. This is our cognitive processes, our beliefs, our expectations, and personality characteristics, behavior and context. He believed that all these things interacted. And he also wanted to talk about observational learning, learning by observing someone else's behavior and its consequences. This teaches us which behaviors are acceptable and rewarded in our culture and which behaviors are socially unacceptable. He also was the one that coined the term self-efficacy, levels of confidence in our abilities developed through social experiences. And this affects how we approach challenges. Question 2 is going to ask you about self-efficacy. What are the differences between someone with high self-efficacy? So that means that they have a high level of confidence in their abilities. They believe that they can experience and create change. They have high confidence in their abilities. Someone with low self-efficacy doesn't believe that they have a lot of power over the ability to change or approach challenges in an appropriate way. You'll want to explain the differences between low and high self-efficacy. This is a great way to talk about reciprocal determinism. This is the idea that our behavior, cognitive processes, and situational context all influence one another. From here, you've got Julian Rotter and his idea of locus of control. Rotter believed in the locus of control, which is our beliefs about the power we have over our own lives. He proposed that as a cognitive factor that affects learning and personality development. So if we look back at Bandura and those cognitive factors, the locus of control is one of those cognitive factors. An internal locus of control means that we tend to believe that most of our outcomes are the direct result of our efforts. People who have an internal locus of control perform better academically, they achieve more in careers, they're more independent, they're healthier, and they're less depressed. Someone with an internal locus of control might say, I am in control of the outcomes. Believe that one's effort and decisions determine their outcomes. External locus of control tends to believe that our outcomes are outside of our control. They believe lives are controlled by other people, luck, or chance. Outcomes are beyond their control. And it does occur on a continuum. So it could potentially swing back and forth depending upon the other aspects of your personality. From here, we've got Walter Mischel. Now he wanted to look at the person-situation debate. Mischel's findings were that behavior was inconsistent across different situations, but more consistent within situations. He also found that behavior is consistent in equivalent situations across time. Now, this data did not support the theory that a person's personality traits are consistent across situations. This then triggered the person-situation debate among psychologists. They did this through the Marshmallow Study, and was a study on self-regulation, aka willpower, and the ability to delay gratification. You've seen these all in these new videos via Instagram and TikTok and whatnot, where a parent will give a child a treat or place it in front of them and tell the child, no, you cannot have this, wait until I come back from the room. So children were placed in a room with one marshmallow on the table. They were then told that they could either eat it now or wait until the researcher returned and could then have 2 marshmallows. This revealed that children differ in levels of self-control. Children that had more self-control waited for the 2 marshmallows in preschool were more successful in high school. Children that had poorer self-control took 1 marshmallow in preschool were more likely to have academic and behavioral problems. So Michelle's approach to personality was that people use cognitive processes to assess the situation in their own way and behaving in accordance with that interpretation. It is not a one-shoe-fits-all when it comes to specific situations. Every person approaches and assesses a situation differently and creates their own approach. From this, we looked at the humanistic approach to the personality. The humanistic approach focuses on how healthy people develop. Freud was focusing on all those negative things, right? How are people becoming aggressive? How are they controlling the id and the superego, right? How are they tamping down this id, trying to make them just act irrationally? Whereas humanists were like, how does a healthy person develop? How do we get to that? So what humanistic personality psychologists did is they studied people that were considered healthy, creative, and productive. So Maslow studied Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and found that they shared similar characteristics. They were open, creative, loving, spontaneous, compassionate, concerned for others, and accepting of themselves. Now, Rogers popped up on the scene and linked personality to self-concept. These are thoughts and feelings about ourselves. Then divided the self into the ideal self and the real self. The ideal self, of course, being the person you would like to be, and the real self, the person you actually are. They believed we needed to find congruence between the ideal and real self. Thoughts about ideal self and real self are similar. Someone with high congruence means that they have a greater sense of self-worth and a healthy, productive life. If there's incongruence between those two selves, then there's some maladjustment that's occurring. Now, Anne Frank famously wrote at the end of her account of hiding from the Nazis, "Despite everything, I believe that people are really good at heart." This sentence captures the essence of the humanistic approach. It would be interesting to think about this on your own time. Do you agree with Freud's darker take on people, that we're driven by impulses, that the ego and superego seek to regulate and control? Or do you lean more towards the humanistic view, that people are basically good and striving towards that self-actualization at that peak of the pyramid we learned about? Now, take your argument back to personality. How do you approach the influences and factors that surround your personality when it comes to these two different approaches? Think about that a little bit. From here, we move on to the biological approaches. These perspectives look at the differences in our personalities and explain them by inherited predispositions or physiological processes. So, do we inherit our personalities? Is it biology that made us who we are? Is it something physiologically about our brains that made us who we are? The only way for people to study this is using heritable traits and studying twins. Minnesota study of twins reared apart found that identical twins, whether raised together or apart, have very similar personalities, which suggests that the heritability of some personality traits. Traits with more than a 0.5 heritability ratio, leadership, obedience to authority, a sense of well-being, alienation, resistance to stress, and fearfulness, meaning these kinds of traits that I just read tend to be heritable. They tend to show themselves in twins that were reared both together and or apart. The reason identical twins are used is because they are genetically no different from one another. They have the same genetic makeup when they're identical twins. Another thing that was looked at from a biological perspective was temperament. Temperament appears very early in life, suggesting that there's got to be a biological basis. Babies can be categorized into one of three temperaments: easy, difficult, or slow to warm up. Environmental factors and maturation can affect expression of personality. There are two dimensions of temperament important to adult personality: reactivity, which is how we respond to new or challenging environmental stimuli, and two, self-regulation. our ability to control responses. Now, somatotypes was developed by William H. Sheldon, believed body type could be linked to personality. He proposed 3 somatotypes. Excuse me. Endomorphs. So that's that first body type that you see on the left. These are relaxed, comfortable, good-humored, even-tempered, sociable, and tolerant. And mesomorphs. These are adventurous, assertive, competitive, and fearless. The body type you see in the middle. And ectomorphs. These are anxious, self-conscious, artistic, thoughtful, quiet, and private. So he believed that there was a body type that could be linked to personality. Now, trait theorists are very different from biological theorists. They believe that people have certain traits, characteristics, or ways of behaving. This is where we kind of go back a little bit to introvert and extrovert, but it's expanded upon. So we're looking at things like optimistic and pessimistic, sociable or shy. Gordon Alpert was the first. He found 4,500 words in the English language that describe people and organized them into 3 categories. You have your cardinal traits, which dominate your entire personality. Very rare. Very rare. Then you have your central traits. These are the ones that really truly make up your personality. And then you have your secondary traits. These are less obvious or consistent. They're present under certain circumstances. These are things like preferences and attitudes that might only display themselves at specific times. Now, Raymond Cattell took that list of 4,500 words that Alpert created and then narrowed it down to about 171 traits. And from here, Cattell identified 16 dimensions of personality. Instead of a trait being present or absent, people are scored on a continuum. From here, Hans and Sybil Eisnig focused on temperament and believed that our personality traits are influenced by our genetic inheritance. They looked at 2 specific personality dimensions. So they took those 17 dimensions that Cattell had and said, we really want to just look at 2. The first one being the difference between extroversion and introversion. Someone who is high in extroversion is sociable and outgoing, and someone who's high in introversion has high need to be alone, engaged in solitary behavior. And the second dimension was neuroticism and stability. Someone is high in neuroticism, they're anxious and overactive, sympathetic nervous system. If they're high in stability, they're more emotionally stable. You can see this depicted on this area here. It very much so harkens back to some of those original things we were looking at when Hippocrates created the humors, and then it was overlaid with Wilhelm Wundt's sort of unchangeable and changeable. The Eisnigs describe 2 factors to account for variations in our personalities. Extroversion and introversion, which you can see here on this line, and emotional stability and instability, which is what you can see here. Okay? So once again, those 4 original humors fall into these 4 categories and fall within the axes you see here. Now, from here, the 5-factor model was created. In the 5-factor model, each person has 5 traits known as the Big 5 personality traits. Each trait is scored on a continuum from high to low, and the first letter of each trait spells the mnemonic ocean. So the first trait is openness. If you score low in openness, you're practical, conventional, and prefers a routine. If you score high on openness, you're curious with a wide range of interests and independent. C is conscientiousness. Scoring low here means that you may be impulsive, careless, and disorganized. High score here means hardworking, dependable, and organized. 3 is extroversion. Low score here means quiet, reserved, and withdrawn. High score, obviously, outgoing, warm, and seeks adventure. The fourth factor is agreeableness. If you score low here, you're more critical. You might be uncooperative and suspicious. High score means helpful, trusting, and empathetic. If you have a 5 on the fifth factor, you might be considered, or this is neuroticism, which if you score low, you're calm, even-tempered, and secure. If you score high, you're anxious, unhappy, prone to negative emotions. Scoring low doesn't mean a bad thing necessarily, right? If you score low in openness, you're practical, conventional, and you prefer routine. That is not a bad thing on the grand scheme of things. But sometimes performing high would be better, right? You want to be considered hardworking, dependable, and organized for the conscientious factor. Another common personality scale like this is the Myers-Briggs Typology Indicator, where you have the scales of extroversion versus introversion, sensing versus intuition, thinking versus feeling, and judging versus perceiving. These models continue on and on. You've got the hexacode traits, so honesty and humility, emotionality, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness. Now, it's important to think about personality from a cultural perspective, and this is question 4 in this chapter. Culture is one of the most important environmental factors that influence personality. Culture equals your beliefs, customs, art, and traditions of a particular society. It helps to ask the question, are personality traits the same across cultures, or are there variations? There are both universal and cultural specific aspects that account for variations in personality. For example, Asian cultures, they're more collectivist. They tend to be less extroverted. However, in Central and South American cultures, they tend to score higher on openness to experiences. And Europeans tend to score higher on neuroticism. And if we look at it regionally, just within the United States, research has found 3 distinct regional personality clusters in the United States. People tend to be friendly and conventional in the upper Midwest and deep South, relaxed, emotionally stable, and creative in the West, and stressed, irritable, and depressed in the Northeast. Now, part of this could be related to weather, as I like to say, right? One explanation for this is selective migration. People choose to move to places that are compatible with their personalities and needs. So you might find clusters like this because someone who lives in the Northeast that doesn't stress or get irritable or depressed might move to the West because they're more creative and they want to be in an area that has more creativity. Now, individualist and collectivistic cultures. This is covered in chapter 11, but you will have a question on this in chapter 12. I will cover that then. In the individualist and collectivistic cultures, individualistic cultures value independence, competition, and personal achievement. So this is mainly Western natures such as US, England, and Australia. People display more personally oriented personality traits. Stuff for just them. They do believe that there is an I in team. Collectivistic cultures, they value social harmony, respectfulness, and group needs or individual needs. Asia, Africa, and South America, and people display more socially oriented personality traits, meaning that their personality traits are more socially dependent upon others. I'm going to skip the last 2 scales or the last few slides of this. You can certainly go through them, but they're not things that I'm going to be reviewing with you in great demand. Okay? I want to move on to chapter 12. So chapter 12 is all about social psychology. How does the presence of other people influence the behavior of individuals? Dyads and groups, dyads meaning 2 people, couples. It's incredibly important that we think about social psychology in a psychology class. Especially in these last few months. It's been a fairly trying time. Trayvon Martin was 17, was shot to death at the hands of Jordan Zimmerman, a volunteer neighborhood watchman, in 2012. Was his death the result of self-defense or racial bias? That question drew hundreds of people to rally on each side of this heated debate, because it is just that, a heated debate, and oftentimes influenced by social psychology. Social psychology deals with all kinds of interactions between people, spanning a wide range of how we connect, from moments of confrontation to moments of working together and helping others. Social psychologists believe that an individual's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are influenced by social situations. Read that again. Social psychologists believe that an individual's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are influenced by social situations. They might look at things like intrapersonal topics. These are emotions and attitudes, the self, the social cognition. Interpersonal topics include helping behavior, aggression, prejudice, and discrimination. Attraction in close relationships, and group processes in intergroup relationships. I'm going to go back for a second. Early evolutionary pressures favored humans who chose to affiliate or associate with others, and by doing so sculpted much of the social behavior that we observe today. We react negatively to the withdrawal of social support. Social isolation shares similar risks of death and high blood pressure, obesity, and a sedentary lifestyle, and is positively correlated with the risk of suicide. Disruptions of social connections through divorce, bereavement, separation, or ridicule are known to be among the most stressful experiences that people may face. Evidence that our need for social contact has been incorporated into our genetic heritage can be found in our development and our biology. Instinctively, we must be social with others in order to survive. So it's really critical that it be covered as its own topic in this field. Now, our success in the social world begins with our ability to perceive the characteristics and intentions of others. We not only size up other people very quickly in terms of their personal characteristics, but we also ask why they behave the way that they do. Being able to predict the behavior of others has significant value to our survival. Situationism is the view that our behavior and actions are determined by our immediate environment and surroundings, and is often used by psychologists. Dispositionism is the view that our behavior is determined by internal factors. This is attribute of a person, such as personality traits and temperament. And this is favored in the US and used by personality psychologists. Modern social psychologists often consider both the situation and the individual. Now, judgments about the causes of a person's behavior are known as attributes. Internal attributions are judgments assigning the cause of a person's behavior to his or her personality qualities or characteristics. So dispositionism is very similar to attributions or internal attributions. Whereas situational attributions are judgments assigning the cause of a person's behavior to his or her environment, what lie outside of the person. Now, this then created what was known as the fundamental attribution error. This is the tendency to overemphasize internal factors as explanations and attributions for the behavior of other people, and underestimate the power of the situation. People tend to fail to recognize when a person's behavior is due to situational variables. We oftentimes say that people are behaving the way they are because they might have something else that occurred to them. They might have learned to behave this way after facing a trauma early in their lives, as a way to maybe excuse bad behavior. You could see this in the Quizmaster study example. Participants were randomly assigned to play the role of either the questioner or the participant. Questioners developed difficult questions to which they knew the answers. Participants answered the questions correctly 4 out of 10 times. Participants tended to disregard the influence of the situation and wrongly concluded that the questioner's knowledge was greater than their own, when really it was not. Another good example is if somebody cuts you off in traffic or goes speeding by you, it's common to think that person is reckless or going to kill someone, when really they could be in a difficult situation and rushing to meet a relative who's sick in the hospital. Another example is when people attribute the actions of movie characters to the actor or actress's personality. Who they are in a movie is who they are in real life, is another good example of fundamental attribution error. Now, it's good for us to ask if this is a universal phenomenon. Research suggests that people from an individualistic culture have the greatest tendency to commit the fundamental attribution error. People from collectivistic cultures, such as some Asian cultures, are more likely to emphasize relationships with others than to focus primarily on the individual. Focusing on others provides a broader perspective, including both situation and cultural influences. Activities such as preparing a meal, hanging out, and playing a game engage people in a group. Social psychologists also created or study the actor-observer bias. This is the phenomenon of explaining other people's behaviors are due to internal factors and our own behaviors are due to situational forces. We often make the fundamental attribution error because we do not have enough information to make a situational explanation about the person's behavior. However, when we explain our own behaviors, we have more information available and are more likely to make situational explanations. One study investigated reasons male participants gave for why they liked their girlfriend. The actor-observer bias is evident when subjects explain their own reasons for liking a girlfriend, example, her personality, versus their impressions of others' reasons for liking a girlfriend. So the actor-observer bias is our tendency to attribute others' actions to internal factors, while attributing our own actions to external factors. We are more aware of the situational factors that affect us. When we observe others, however, situational factors are unknown. Another example. Imagine you're driving on the freeway and suddenly notice that your exit is right up ahead, but you're in the left lane. You might mash down on the accelerator and get ahead of traffic and sharply cut off over to the exit. If you're like most people, you will rationalize your behavior by attributing it to external factors. I couldn't get into the line of cars, so I had to speed up. I was thinking about an argument I had earlier, otherwise I would have gotten there a bit sooner. There should be more signs to indicate which exits are coming up. The other drivers on the road, watching you behave this way, are more likely to attribute your behavior to internal factors. What a horrible driver! Just like we did in the fundamental attribution error. So these two biases and errors are kind of working against each other. You use it to explain away your behavior. However, when you watch other people do it, you don't have the ability to lean on this. We then have the self-serving bias. This is our tendency of an individual to take credit by making dispositional or internal attributions for positive outcomes, but situational or external attributions for negative outcomes. This is what people do to protect their self-esteem. It allows people to feel good about their accomplishments. An attribution is a belief about the cause of a result. So one model of attribution proposes 3 different dimensions. One is the locus of control. So we look back at the locus of control that we learned about in chapter 11, internal versus external. We then also look at stability, the extent to which the circumstances are changeable. We also then look at controllability, the extent to which the circumstances can be controlled. When our team wins, we make attributions such as it's talented, works hard, and uses effective strategies. When our team loses, we might say the other team has more experienced players, or the other team played at home, and the weather affected our team's performance. Another classic example can be in a student's reactions to their performance on an exam. Often, success on an exam will be attributed to internal factors. I studied hard, I'm intelligent, I'm good at using particular test-taking strategies. However, a failure, on the other hand, is often attributed to external factors. The questions were unfair. The test didn't cover the material I was told to study. My roommate kept bugging me and I couldn't study. All my professors scheduled exams this week and I didn't have enough time to prepare. Now, we don't always use the self-serving bias, but it does tend to become a general tendency. From this, social psychologists created a just world hypothesis. A consequence of the tendency to provide dispositional explanations for behavior is victim blaming. The just world hypothesis is a belief that people get the outcomes they deserve. This is based on the belief that the world is a fair place and therefore good people experience positive outcomes and bad people experience negative outcomes. This allows people to feel the world is predictable and we have some control over life outcomes. People who hold just world beliefs tend to blame the people in poverty for their circumstances, ignoring situational and cultural causes of poverty. It can be really difficult to really think about your world from this perspective. As much as we like to say that everyone works hard and deserves their outcomes due to how hard they work, there are some cases and situations that are a little bit outside of people's control. This led social psychologists to break down specific things around social psychology. They looked at social roles, which is a pattern behavior that is expected of a person in a given setting or group. So if we think about you guys, you are a student. And being a student, you have specific roles that you display as students. We each have several social roles. So you all might have a social role as a student. You might have a social role within your family as the youngest or the oldest. You might have a social role on a team if you're a captain of a sports team or another team that you might engage in. It's also defined by culturally shared knowledge. Here in the United States, there's a culturally shared knowledge around how a student is supposed to act. And behavior oftentimes related to social roles varies across situations. So how you behave in each of your individual social roles that you hold might vary depending upon the situation that you're in. Now, social norms and social scripts. A social norm is a group's expectation of what is appropriate and acceptable behavior for its members. How are the people in this group supposed to behave and think? What are we expected to talk about in this group? What are we expected to wear? You often see these things depicted in today's television shows and movies, if any of you have seen the movie Mean Girls, for example. Regina George and her followers, and the plastics, as they are called, on Wednesdays wear pink, for example. Social scripts are a person's knowledge about the sequence of events expected in a specific setting. How do you act when you walk into an elevator? On the first day of school? In a restaurant? The elevator example is a great one. When you walk into an elevator, do you walk straight into that elevator and face the back wall of that elevator? No, probably not. You walk into the elevator and you turn around to face the doors. This is a script. You know to do this. You do it in a specific setting. It's expected. And if someone were not to follow that script, it would be abnormal. Scripts, however, can vary between cultures. The important sources of information to guide behavior in certain situations. Social psychologists love studying young people and teens because they struggle to become independent. At the same time, they're also desperately trying to fit in with their peers. Teenagers are desperately seeking to be independent of their parents. They want to be considered mature adults. However, they're also desperately seeking to fit in with their peer group. This was studied quite heavily. One of the first social psychology experiments was done by Philip Zimbardo, and it was the Stanford Prison Experiment. This is question 1 for chapter 12. Please make sure that you read through this thoroughly in order to answer the question. The Stanford Prison Experiment, done in 1971, demonstrated the power of social roles, social norms, and social scripts. So when the question asks you why the participants behaved the way they did, focus on roles, norms, and scripts to answer the question. In this experiment, a mock prison was constructed, and participants, all male college students at Stanford University, were randomly assigned to play the role of prisoners or guards. In a very short amount of time, the guards started to harass the prisoners in an increasingly sadistic manner. Prisoners began to show signs of severe anxiety and hopelessness. The 2-week study that was supposed to go on for a full 2 weeks ended up ending after 6 days because of the way that the guards were treating the prisoners. Social norms required guards to be authoritarian and prisoners to be submissive. And their scripts influenced the way the guards degraded the prisoners by making them do push-ups and removing their privacy. Parallels abuse used by guards in Abu Ghraib prison, meaning that Iraqi prisoners of war were abused by their American captors in Abu Ghraib prison during the Second Iraqi War, and a lot of their prison tactics or their abuse tactics were displayed in the Stanford prison experiment, which was why it had to end at 6 days. This was the worst thing that anyone could have done. It was not thought kindly on in the psychological world. But it did show us what happens for social psychology. Ethically, it was dangerous. But social psychologists found that this experiment was incredibly helpful to them when it came to studying social roles, scripts, and norms. Now, that can't be the only thing that affects our relationships with others. Attitude is our evaluation of a person, an idea, or an object. We can have a positive or negative attitude about a person, an idea, or an object. And it can be influenced by external forces and internal factors that we control. 3 components to attitude are affective components. These are our feelings. So affective means our feelings or emotions. Behavioral component is the effect of the attitude on our behavior. And the cognitive component, our belief and knowledge that influences our attitude. An attitude is a mixture of belief and emotion that predisposes a person to respond to other people, objects, or groups in a positive or negative way. The cognitive component of an attitude is what you believe about a particular object. So if we break cognitive component down even further, it's the component of an attitude is what you believe about a particular object or issue. The affective component consists of your feeling towards the attitudinal object, and the behavioral component refers to your actions towards various people, objects, or institutions. Now, attitudes tend to be formed via direct experience with the object, chance conditioning as a result of smaller numbers of contacts with the attitudinal object, interactions with others, including families and other groups, and the media, including newspapers, television, radio, and internet. You may have developed an attitude about a specific idea, object, or person strictly from Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, Snapchat, whatever social media influences you most, even though you may not have had any direct contact with the person, idea, or object. Now, cognitive dissonance was a huge, huge thing that social psychologists learned through their process of experiment. Leon Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance showed us that psychological discomfort arising from holding 2 or more inconsistent attitudes, behaviors, or cognition. For example, those who smoke cigarettes likely believe cigarettes are bad for your health, but still smoke them anyways. This can lead to cognitive dissonance. They know what they're doing is bad for their health. It says it right on the pack of cigarettes, for heaven's sakes. But they do it anyways. One thing that people can do to reduce cognitive dissonance is change the behavior, obviously. So in this case, they could quit smoking. They could change their belief through rationalization or denial, such as discounting the evidence that smoking is harmful. Many people smoke and live long and healthy lives. Or they could add a new cognition. Smoking suppresses appetite, so I don't become overweight, which is also good for my health. So six half dozen, one and the other. Same thing. Later research has found that only conflicting cognitions that threaten positive self-image cause dissonance. Dissonance can also cause physiological arousal and activate brain regions involved in emotions and cognitive functioning. Another example of cognitive dissonance could be seen today in the world around the idea of the vaccine requirement for COVID-19. Though many health officials said that it's incredibly important and can do nothing but keep you healthy and safe from COVID-19, many people believed that getting the vaccine was against their religious beliefs or not necessary for them. They didn't need it prior to the vaccine being created to keep COVID-19 away. So what's this necessary now? You can see cognitive dissonance in so many other areas, and it's a really big topic. Here's another diagram depicting cognitive dissonance. Now, the effect of initiation. The justification of effort has a distinct effect on a person liking a group. A difficult initiation into group influences us to like the group more. This showcased Aronson and Mills' experiment in 1959. College students volunteered to join a group that would regularly discuss the psychology of sex. There were 3 conditions. There was no initiation for some, easy initiation for others, and a difficult initiation for the third group. Students in the difficult initiation condition liked the group more than the students in other conditions due to the justification of effort. Our ability to want to be involved in a group or engaged in a group goes up when it's more difficult to access that group. You see this in colleges today when it comes to Greek life, fraternities, sororities. The harder it is to get into any of these groups, the more ideal these groups are to want to become a part of, right? The more you want to be a part of those groups that have harder and harder chances to get into. Or think about your experience with applying to colleges. The more difficult to get into a school might make it more promising for you. That's the group you want to be a part of more. Social psychologists then discuss persuasion. This is the process of changing our attitudes towards something based on some kind of communication. How do people convince others to change their attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors? This is a deliberate attempt to change attitudes or beliefs too, right? So you're not doing it sort of like unconscious. You're deliberately trying to persuade someone. Attitude change occurs through one of 2 routes of cognitive processing. The central route occurs when a person considers persuasive arguments carefully and thoughtfully. When you're motivated and knowledgeable about a topic, you tend to engage in more elaborative processing around this. We encounter attempts at persuasion everywhere. Persuasion is not limited to formal advertising. We are confronted with it throughout our everyday world, through bumper stickers like you see on this car here. Or even all those ads, those targeted ads, especially now with social media. Everyone is getting targeted ads. I bought a new shampoo on Amazon, and now all I get on Instagram is ads for shampoos or hair care. It's insane. Now, the elaboration likelihood model by Petty and Chiappo. Persuasion can take one of 2 paths, and the durability of the end result depends on the path taken. The central route is logic-driven. This uses data and facts. The direct route to persuasion focuses on the quality of the information. Works best when audiences are analytical and willing to engage in processing of the information. So central route is logic-driven. Data, facts, science, so to speak. The peripheral route is an indirect route. This uses peripheral cues to associate positivity with the message. Using characteristics such as positive emotion or celebrity endorsement results in less permanent attitude change. So if you use the central route, you're going to change your attitude and it's probably going to stay there. Okay? Whereas if you use the peripheral route, your attitude may change, but not forever. Okay? So if you look at this diagram, you can more clearly see what they mean. You have a persuasive message you want to convey. If you take the central route, your audience is motivated and analytical. They have high effort and evaluate their messaging when processing, and it's a lasting change in attitude. Peripheral route, however, is a temporary change in attitude. Not a ton of effort takes place. Now, the foot in the door technique when it comes to persuasion is the persuader gets a person to agree to a smaller favor, only to later request a larger favor. Our past behavior often directs our future behavior, right? We desire to maintain consistency when it comes to how we behave. We don't want to be considered flip-floppers. With the foot in the door technique, a small request such as wearing a campaign button can turn into a large request such as putting campaign signs in your yard. Now, conformity was a concept kind of around persuasion. Solomon Asch defined conformity as the change in a person's behavior to go along with the group, even if they do not agree with the group. Asch's experiment was this. The line segments illustrate the judgment task in Asch's conformity study. Which line on the right, A, B, or C, is the same length as the line X on the left? The influence of the group majority on the individual's judgment was known as the Asch effect. In Asch's study, there was one naive subject. The rest were Confederates who purposely gave the wrong answer. 76 of the participants conformed to group pressure at least once by also indicating the incorrect line. What factors make a person more likely to conform? So through this study, where they asked Confederates to say, give them the wrong answer, say it's line B, very clearly not the same length as line X. And 76% of the time, the naive person who was not a Confederate said, yeah, they're totally right. It's definitely B. They then decided to take a look at that 76% of participants who conformed, who agreed with the group when they answered incorrectly. And it was the size of the majority. The greater the majority, the more likely an individual will conform. So if it was a small group of maybe like 1 or 2 people, maybe people would have been less likely to conform. But if the Confederate group equals over 10 people, that's a pretty big majority. The presence of another dissenter causes conformity rates to drop to near zero. Had there been one person in that group who had said, B is absolutely not the correct answer, it's definitely C, then the naive person would have been more likely to dissent along with them and say, you're wrong. And the public or private nature of the responses. Public responses cause more conformity than private. It's why many times when you participate in voting for government officials, it's done privately in order to reduce the pressure of conformity. However, there is motivation to conform. Normative social influence is people conforming to the group norm to fit in, to feel good, and be accepted by the group. Informational social influence is people conforming because they believe the group is competent and has the correct information, particularly when the task or situation is ambiguous. People in crowds tend to take cues from others and act accordingly. For example, in picture A, an audience is listening to a lecture and people are relatively quiet, still, and attentive to the speaker on stage. And in B, an audience at a rock concert where people are dancing, singing, and possibly engaging in activities like crowd surfing. So we tend to conform depending upon the situations that we're in. From here, we also study obedience. You remember obedience. We covered it right away in the first chapter. Obedience is the change of an individual's behavior to comply with a demand by an authority figure. The Milgram study on obedience showed the surprising degree at which people obey authority. Participants were told to shock learners, or Confederates, for giving wrong answers to test items. Participants believed they were giving the learners shocks, which increased all the way up to 450 volts. 2 out of 3 participants continued to administer the shocks to an unresponsive learner. meaning who knows what state this person was in when they gave them those shocks, but they still continued to be obedient to the authority figure telling them to give them shocks. This led social psychologists to then start to think about groupthink, the modification of the opinions of members of a group to align with what they believe is the group consensus. This is going to be question 3 in chapter 12. Groups often take action that individuals would not perform outside the group setting because groups make more extreme decisions than individuals do. Members are less likely to express diverse opinions, which can lead to faulty decision making. The question is going to ask you what things you can do in order to combat groupthink. Okay? Groupthink is a flawed decision-making process. This might account for a number of unfortunate group decisions throughout history, including the Challenger explosion and the preemptive strike on Iraq, based on the conviction at the time that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. If people are afraid to speak out or rock the boat, the flaws in a plan may never come to light. In some cases, leaders of a group are unwilling to tolerate dissent. In other cases, there may be implicit pressure to present alternate views. Groupthink is especially likely in cohesive groups with high morale whose members already share a similar attitude. One of the dangers in a White House, based on my reading of history, is that you get wrapped up in groupthink and everybody agrees with everything and there's no discussion and there are no dissenting views. This is a quote from Barack Obama in 2008. It's important when groupthink comes around that you allow opposing views to come into play in order to combat groupthink and group polarization. Group polarization is the strengthening of an original group attitude after the discussion of views within a group. Think about this question. Does your opinion change if you find someone attractive, but your friends do not agree? Now, question 4 is all about social facilitation and social loafing. Social facilitation occurs when an individual performs better when an audience is watching than when the individual performs the behavior alone. This tends to occur when people are performing a task for which they are skilled or an easy task. However, when people are nervous or less skilled, an audience may hinder rather than help. So it's when people can perform when someone is watching them. Social loafing is the exertion of less effort by a person working together within a group. This occurs when individual performances cannot be evaluated separately from the group. Group performance declines on easy tasks. However, when a task is difficult, people feel more motivated and believe that their group needs their input to do well on a challenging project. Social loafing is very much what happens when you're doing a group project, and one group member may not perform to the highest of their abilities because you can distribute the work a lot more across others. And it can just come off as still a group win, even if you didn't exert yourself all that much. So question 4 is going to ask you to describe the difference between social facilitation and social loafing. Define them. Explain them in deep. Social psychologists also study prejudice and discrimination. These two things occur across the globe. In Image A, a 1939 sign in German-occupied Poland warns no entrance for Poles. Except this was Poland, for heaven's sakes. The whole country was Poles. But German had occupied Polish at that time and was beginning to segregate the country. In Image B, an African-American male drinks from a designated colored water fountain in Oklahoma in 1939, during the era of racial segregation as a practice of discrimination. And in Image C, a member of Westboro Baptist Church, widely identified as a hate group, engages in discrimination based on religion and sexual orientation. It's important to understand prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is a negative attitude and feeling toward an individual based solely on one's membership in a particular social group. I hate Yankees fans. They make me angry. Only because the fan is a fan of Yankees. Do they create an attitude or feeling? A stereotype is a specific belief or assumption about individuals based solely on their membership in a group. So this is when you actually describe a characteristic about that group. Yankees fans are arrogant and obnoxious. Discrimination, a negative action toward an individual as a result of one's membership in a particular group. I would never hire nor become friends with a person if I knew he or she was a Yankees fan. Now, why do these things exist? How did these three things come to exist? They came to exist through social learning and conformity to social norms. Some types of prejudice and discrimination are racism. This is a prejudice and discrimination against individuals based on their race. Some social psychologists look at it from a dual attitudes model: explicit, conscious, and controllable. They are explicitly racist. They are consciously deciding to be prejudiced and discriminating against those based on their race. Implicit bias is unconscious and uncontrollable. Most people no longer show extreme racial biases on measures of explicit attitudes, but measures of implicit attitudes often provide evidence of mild to strong racial bias and prejudice. This can explain why modern forms of racism are really hard to detect. You then have ageism, which is a prejudice and discrimination towards individuals based solely on their age. This is typically against older adults. However, with the way we describe generations, lots of prejudice is placed on younger generations these days. Homophobia is prejudice and discrimination of individuals based solely on their sexual orientation, and often results in discrimination of individuals from social groups. This is widespread in U.S. society. Sexism is prejudice and discrimination toward individuals based on their sex. Common examples include gender role expectations and expectations for how a gender group should behave. This can exist on a societal level. Employment and education opportunities. Women now have many jobs previously closed to them, though they still face challenges in male-dominated occupations. Social psychologists also use these to look at the self-fulfilling prophecy and confirmation bias. Self-fulfilling prophecy is an expectation held by a person that alters his or her behavior in a way that tends to make it true. So a stereotype might exist that creates expectations about a stereotype that then causes a person to treat someone according to our expectations, which is based on a stereotype, which influences that person to act according to the stereotypic expectations, which conforms to our stereotypic beliefs. Rosenthal and Jacobson in 1968 studied this using disadvantaged students who had teachers that expected them to perform well had higher grades than disadvantaged students whose teachers expected them to do poorly. They fulfilled a self-fulfilling prophecy. Their teachers stereotypically believed that they weren't going to perform well because that was their expectations based upon their stereotype because they were disadvantaged. And then they confirmed the stereotypic beliefs. A confirmation bias is our tendency to seek out information that supports our stereotypes and ignore information that is inconsistent with our stereotypes. So if I believe that this stereotype is true and real, then I'm only going to look for information that confirms that. Social psychologists also studied in-groups and out-groups. In-groups is a group that we identify with or see ourselves as belonging to. Okay? My in-group is female, for example. And out-groups is a group that we view as fundamentally different from us. I'm fundamentally not male, so that is my out-group. In-group bias is a prejudice and discrimination because the out-group is perceived as different and is less preferred than our in-group. We want to feel good and protect our in-groups, which means that I'm going to stick up for females and not so much so for males. The forces that promote reconciliation between these two groups is the expression of empathy, being able to empathize with our out-groups, acknowledgement of past suffering on both sides, and the halting of destructive behaviors. Scapegoating is the act of blaming an out-group when the in-group experiences frustration or is blocked from obtaining a goal. Scapegoating could be in stating that females have never been paid at the same rate that males have. And I might be scapegoating by blaming the males for this infrastructure, right? We can't get to our goal because all of the CEOs and everyone in power in order to change that pay equity gap are males. Social psychologists also study aggression. Aggression is seeking to cause harm or pain to another person. Hostile aggression is motivated by feelings of anger with intent to cause pain. So a bar fight is hostile aggression. Instrumental aggression is motivated by achieving a goal and does not necessarily involve intent to cause pain. This is typically displayed by women. Communication that impairs the social standing of another person. So spreading lies that lowers the social standing of someone else. The frustration aggression theory states that when humans are prevented from achieving an important goal, they become frustrated and aggressive. I think we can all agree that that is actually true. The evolutionary theory of aggression states that aggression serves as an evolutionary function. We need it to survive. Men are more likely to show aggression, likely serves to display dominance over other males. It's to protect a mate, to perpetuate the male's genes. Human males and non-human males, aka primates, like monkeys, endeavor to gain and display dominance over other males, as demonstrated in the behavior of the monkeys in this photo. This then is what led to bullying. Bullying is repeated negative treatment of another person over time. This is the attempt to inflict harm, injury, or humiliation, and it can include physical or verbal attacks, and can also be psychological. Now, there are gender differences in boys. Boys tend to engage in direct physical aggression forms of bullying, whereas girls tend to engage in indirect social forms of aggression, spreading rumors, ignoring, or socially isolating others. The effects on the victims who are bullied: decreased mental health, including anxiety and depression, and may underperform in schoolwork. Cyberbullying has become huge since the invention of social media, including just cell phones and smartphones. Repeated behavior that is intended to cause psychological and emotional harm to another person. This is more common in girls, usually in those that have been victims of cyberbullying themselves. So you might actually be able to trace back someone who cyberbullies another was actually cyberbullied themselves. This led social psychologists to actually study the bystander effect. Kitty Genovese in 1964 was attacked and killed with a knife outside her apartment building. Residents in the apartment building heard her scream for help numerous times, but did nothing. Latane and Darley studied the bystander effect, which was a phenomenon in which witness and bystander does not volunteer to help a victim, person in distress, based on the social situation, and it's not personality specific. It's all about the social situation. The diffusion of responsibility is the tendency for no one in a group to help because the responsibility to help is spread throughout the group, meaning I'm not going to help because I'm assuming someone else is going to go and help instead. Now, pro-social behavior and altruism. Pro-social behavior is voluntary behavior with the intent to help other people. So this is pretty much the exact opposite of aggression. Altruism is defined as people's desire to help others, even if the costs outweigh the benefits of helping. The events of 9/11 unleashed an enormous show of altruism and heroism on the parts of first responders and many other ordinary people. This then created the theories on the motivation to help. Empathy is the capacity to understand another person's perspective, to feel what she feels. Empathetic people make emotional connections with others and feel compelled to help. The second is altruism, is a form of selfless helping, not motivated by benefits. Feeling good after helping is a consequence, not a cause. 3, helping is self-serving because our egos are involved and we receive benefits. Now, social psychology obviously helps us to form relationships. What influences who become friends with and form romantic relationships with? First, proximity. The people with whom you have the most contact are obviously those that you're going to form relationships with. Second, similarity. People who are similar to us in background, attitudes, and lifestyle. Then homophily. The tendency for people to form social networks with others who are similar to them is another phrase for similarity. Important components of relationships. Reciprocity, the give and take in relationships. We contribute to relationships but expect to receive benefits in return. This is what could potentially lead to one-sided relationships. Someone who's always giving and the other always taking. Another important component of relationships is self-disclosure, the sharing of personal information. This leads to more intimate connections. Many couples share cultural backgrounds oftentimes. How do we find someone attractive? What features of a person do we find attractive? Universally attractive features in women: physical, large eyes, high cheekbones, a narrow jawline, a slender build, and a lower waist to hip ratio. Social traits: warmth, affection, and social skills. In men, we want physical, tall, having broad shoulders and a narrow waist. Social traits: achievement, leadership quality, and job skills. The matching hypothesis: people tend to pick someone they view as their equal in physical attractiveness and social desirability. Sternberg's triangular theory of love. 7 types of love can be described by combinations of 3 components. Intimacy, which is the sharing of details and intimate thoughts and emotions. Passion, which is physical attraction. And commitment, which is standing by that person. According to Sternberg, consummate love describes a healthy relationship containing intimacy, passion, and commitment. In social exchange theory, what determines whether we are satisfied with and stay in a relationship? This theory, acting like a naive economist, people may keep track of the costs and benefits of forming and maintaining a relationship. Typically, only those relationships in which the benefits outweigh the costs will be maintained. So the last chapter for this week is stress, lifestyle, and health. Now, I'm sure as you're listening to this, many of you are stressed out. This chapter will help us to understand what other feelings might accompany stress. Do we all feel stress? Is it universal? Do we all feel the same things? We're going to explore our current understandings of stress, which include psychological and physiological natures of stress, causes and consequences of stress, and stress management techniques. Won't that be fun? Stress is a term used loosely to describe a variety of unpleasant feeling states. So, example, frustrated, angry, conflicted, overwhelmed, or fatigued. Stimulus-based definitions. Stress is a demanding or threatening event/situation. Example, a high-stress job. This characterizes stress as a stimulus that causes certain reactions. It fails to recognize that people differ in how they view and react to challenging situations. Whereas response-based definitions of stress emphasizes the physiological responses that occur in response to demanding or threatening situations. This characterizes stress as a response to environmental condition. Neither provide a complete definition of stress. Well, isn't that great? So, in order to define stress, we have to do it from a cognitive appraisal standpoint. Stress is a process whereby an individual perceives and responds to events they appraise as overwhelming or threatening to their well-being. The definition places importance on how we appraise, meaning judge, demanding and threatening events, also known as stressors, which then influence our reaction. We end up going through primary appraisal, judgment about the degree of potential harm/threat to well-being that a stressor might entail. If it's a threat, that stressor could lead to harm, loss, or negative consequences. If it's considered a challenge, then that stressor carries the potential for personal growth or gain. For example, graduating from college and entering the workforce can be viewed as either a threat, because you're getting loss of financial support, or a challenge, the opportunity for independence and growth. If we appraise it at the secondary level, this is the judgment of the options available to cope with the stressor and perceptions on how effective such options will be. A threat is less stressful if we believe something can be done about it. So think about it from this sort of diagram. Stress is less likely to result if a stressor is perceived as extremely threatening or threatening with fewer or no effective coping options available. This diagram shows you that you have a stressor. For example, say we receive a job offer that's only $20,000 in full-time salary for a year. Is this a challenge or a threat? So first we look at that as a challenge or a threat. Is there potential for gain or growth with a salary of $20,000? Or can this lead to harm, loss, or negative consequences? If it does pose a threat, then we take it through a secondary appraisal. What are the potential options and how effective? If there are effective options to get through this particular period or this particular threat, then it's a low threat. If there are ineffective or no options to get through this threat, then it's a very high threat. Now, does this mean that stress is only bad? No. Some stress is categorized as good stress, also known as eustress. This is stress that can be positive and motivate us to do things in our best interests. They're associated with positive feelings, optimal health, and performance. Distress is bad stress. This is what causes people to feel burned out, fatigued, and exhausted, and performance can decline. As the stress level increases from low to moderate, so does performance. At the optimal level, which is the peak of the curve, performance has reached its peak. If stress exceeds the optimal level, it will reach the distress region, will become excessive and debilitating, and performance will decline. Now, the prevalence of stress. Stress is everywhere. Everywhere. And it plays a role in all of our lives to some extent. Stress can evoke a variety of responses, including physiological, so think accelerated heart rate, headaches, or gastrointestinal problems. Cognitive, so difficulty concentrating or making decisions. And behavioral, you might drink alcohol, smoke, or taking actions directed at eliminating the cause of the stress. Nearly half of U.S. adults indicated that their stress levels have increased over the last 5 years, meaning I don't think it's going to go away. Now, health psychology is subdivided, okay? To understanding the importance of psychological influence on health, illness, and how people respond when they become ill. It investigates the connection between stress and illness, why people make certain life choices, the effectiveness of intervention aimed at changing unhealthy behaviors, which group of people are especially at risk for negative health outcomes based on psychological and behavioral factors. So this is where people began to look at stress among demographic groups. National surveys found that there's higher stress in women than in men. Higher levels of stress in those that are unemployed, had less education and less income. And retired persons reported lowest levels of stress. From 2006 to 2009, the greatest increase in stress levels occurred among men. Whites, people aged 45 to 64, college graduates, and those with full-time employment. Now, the change was potentially due to the 2008-2009 economic down. And you can see stress among demographic groups displayed here in these graphs. And it looks at stress levels among different demographic groups during the years of 1983, 2006, and 2009. Now, early contributions to the study of stress were done by Walter Cannon in the early 20th century. He first identified the body's physiological reaction to stress, first articulated and named the fight or flight response, which he suggested is a built-in mechanism that stabilizes physiological variables at levels optimal for survival. So he was the first to look at the fight or flight response. This was a set of physiological reactions that occur when an individual encounters a perceived threat. This is produced by activation of the sympathetic nervous system and the endocrine system. This arousal prepares a person to either fight or flee from a perceived threat. And it's an adaptive response, and it's helpful in species survival. In response to a threatening stressor, the adrenal glands release epinephrine, so this is adrenaline, and norepinephrine, or noradrenaline, which causes physiological changes in the body as shown below. So your pupils will dilate, your heart rate increases, your respiration quickens, and your bronchial tubes dilate, your muscles tense and may tremble, and perspiration begins. This then led to the general adaptation syndrome developed by Hans Selye. Hans Selye specialized in research about stress. This is going to help you answer question 1. Hans noticed that prolonged exposure to stressor caused rats to show signs of adrenal enlargement, thymus and lymph node shrinkage, and stomach ulceration. The same pattern of physiological reactions occurred regardless of the stressor. Selye had discovered the general adaptation syndrome, which is the body's nonspecific physiological response to stress. He believed that it occurred in 3 stages. Alarm reaction. This is your body's immediate reaction upon facing a threatening situation or emergency. Physiological reactions that provide energy to manage the situation. You then have a stage of resistance. This is when the body has adapted or readjusted to the stressor, but remains alert and prepared to respond, but with just a little less intensity. So your reactions might diminish. Then 3 is stage of exhaustion. The person can no longer adapt to the stressor, depletion of physical resources, and physical wear takes its toll on the body's tissues and organs, which may result in illness, disease, or even death. Question 1 is going to ask you to discuss a stressor and then explain how that stressor is affecting you physically according to the general adaptation syndrome. So you might talk about how your body reacts after studying for exams, a stressful period that causes a threat, reacts to a chronic illness that a family member may be facing. Okay? You can see the 3 stages of Selye's general adaptation syndrome shown here in this graph. Prolonged stress ultimately results in exhaustion. Now, the physiological basis of stress. The sympathetic nervous system is what triggers arousal in response to a stressor via the release of adrenaline from the adrenal glands. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, this is the HPA axis, showcases this by stress, then causes hypothalamus release, corticotrophin release factor, so it releases a hormone. That then causes the pituitary gland to release ACTH. Then ACTH activates the adrenal glands, and then the adrenal glands release hormones, including cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone that helps provide a boost of energy when we first encounter a stressor, preparing us for fight or flee. Continuous elevated levels of cortisol means chronic stress and can oftentimes weaken the immune system. If you experience chronic stress for a prolonged period of time, think about it from this perspective. How often have you experienced chronic stress and then somehow gotten sick, a cold or a flu? It can happen. Many cases of depression are preceded by unusually stressful events, for example. In moments of stress, this process can provide energy, improve immune system functioning, and temporarily decrease pain sensitivity. Now, let's look at some specific stressors. Chronic stressors are events that persist over an extended period of time. Think about long-term unemployment as a chronic stressor. Acute stressors are brief events that sometimes continue to be experienced as overwhelming well after the event has ended. E.g. falling and breaking a leg. Now, I can personally identify with this as I just literally broke my foot this weekend. Not fun. I don't recommend it. Traumatic events is one category of stressors or traumatic events. These are situations involving exposure to actual or threatened death or serious injury. Exposure to military combat is a traumatic event. Threatened and actual physical assault, so attack, sexual assault, childhood abuse, robbery. Terrorist attacks, natural disasters, and car accidents. Stressors of this type can cause people to develop post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. This is a chronic stress reaction including intrusive and painful memories, jumpiness, and persistent negative emotional states, among other symptoms. Now, life changes. Some fairly typical life events, such as moving, can be significant stressors. Even when the move is intentional and positive, the amount of resulting change in daily life can cause stress. This led Holmes and Rahe in the 1960s to create the Social Readjustment Rating Scale, or SRRS. They hypothesized that life events requiring significant change are stressful, whether they are desirable or undesirable. This is going to help you with question 2. Question 2 is asking you to identify something from the Social Readjustment Rating Scale. You can find an example in your text or even online. It consists of 43 life events that require varying degrees of personal readjustment. And it's going to ask you how that life event can cause both distress, so negative stress, and eustress, which is positive stress. They developed this scale by asking 394 participants to provide a numerical estimate corresponding to how much readjustment they felt each event would require. Each life event has a social score/life change unit, or LCU, from 11 to 100, representing the perceived magnitude of life change they involve. Death of a spouse was ranked the highest at 100, and divorce was ranked second highest at 73. Now, say we use those two as the example, and we said describe the distress and the eustress of the death of a spouse. You could say the distress of the death of a spouse could be loss of the intimate partner, best friend, learning how to deal with the loss of that best friend or partner could cause distress. Say the marriage wasn't a happy one, though, so some eustress could come out of that, no longer having to care for someone who might have been chronically ill or terminally ill could be cause of eustress when they pass. Divorce as well. There's a sadness there of ending a long-term relationship. But there also could be eustress in that it might not have been a happy relationship or a happy marriage, and divorce was really necessary in order to be happier and less stressed. Research demonstrates that accumulating a high number of LCUs within a brief time period is related to a range of physical illness symptoms and mental health problems. This is used to assess the amount of stress in people's lives. So if someone is experiencing multiple things on that social readjustment rating scale at one time, and they're just accumulating more LCUs and more LCUs and more LCUs, then it could end up having a huge effect on their physical health as well as their mental health. Now, we also need to talk about daily hassles. Daily hassles are stressful, but they're minor irritations and annoyances that are part of our everyday lives. They often lead to negative and distressed mood states, can build up and leave us feeling stressed. And the frequency of daily hassles is a better predictor of physical and psychological health than life change units. For example, our daily commutes, whether on the road or via public transportation, can be hassles that contribute to our feelings of everyday stress. Now, other stressors are high stress occupations. These are difficult, demanding, or unsafe work conditions. So occupations containing unpleasant elements, so exposure to loud noise, harassment, threats of physical violence, constant frustration. Job strain is a work situation that combines excessive job demands and workload with little discretion in decision-making or job control. This is oftentimes associated with increased risk of physical problems. Job burnout is a general sense of emotional exhaustion and cynicism in relation to one's job. This occurs frequently among people in human service jobs, so think social workers, teachers, police officers. You wouldn't believe it, but close relationships can often be considered a stressor. Relationships with friends and family can be a source of stress. Negative aspects that can cause stress include adverse exchanges and conflicts, lack of emotional support or confiding, and a lack of reciprocity. It's important that you find relationships with others that cause as minimal stress as possible. But you can't avoid it. It's oftentimes unavoidable. So now we want to look at stress and illness. Psychophysiological disorders is when chronic stress and its sustained physiological reactions can lead to wear and tear on the body. Sustained high blood pressure can lead to a heart attack or heart failure, and continuous exposure to cortisol can weaken the immune system, putting a person at risk for infection or disease. Thus, health psychologists looked at psychophysiological disorders. These are physical disorders / diseases whose symptoms are brought about or worsened by stress and emotional factors. Common examples include tension headaches, asthma, acne, eczema, hypertension, irritable bowel syndrome, and coronary heart disease. When studying stress in the immune system, we need to look at the immune system errors. Things like autoimmune diseases. Our immune system mistakes the body's own healthy cells for invaders and repeatedly attacks them, which can affect almost any part of the body. Immunosuppression is the decreased effectiveness of our immune system. This causes people to become susceptible to infections, illnesses, and diseases. Now, if we look at stressors in an immune function, we want to make sure that we study psychoneuroimmunology. This is a field that studies how psychological factors influence the immune system and immune functioning. Studies have shown that the immune system can be classically conditioned, leading to the idea that if classical conditioning can alter immunity, then we can also alter other psychological factors. Many kinds of stressors are associated with poor and weakened immune functioning. So how does stress weaken the immune system? One way that the immune system is weakened is through the hormones released during stress. These hormones inhibit the production of lymphocytes. These are white blood cells important to your immune response. So Cohen in 1998, that's how early health psychology is. It's been done more recently than most psychology. Did a study on stress and immune function. Looked at 276 healthy volunteers who were interviewed about recent stressful experiences. After the interview, they were given nasal drops containing the cold virus. This graph shows the percentages of participants who developed colds after receiving the cold virus, after reporting having experienced chronic stressors lasting at least 1 month, 3 months, or 6 months. Participants who reported experiencing chronic stressors for more than 1 month were more likely to develop colds than those who had reported no chronic stress. Now, if we look at stress and aging, research suggests that stress can shorten telomeres. These are segments of your DNA that protect the ends of chromosomes. Shortened telomeres can inhibit / block cell division, which includes growth and proliferation of new cells, leading to more rapid aging. So this graph shows that telomeres are shorter in adults who experience more trauma as children. So as the number of adversities are experienced, their telomeres are shortened, which means that they are aging at more rapidly pace, which means that death may occur a lot sooner. Now, cardiovascular disorders plays a central role in the stress response, making it a key focus in studies of psychophysiological disorders. Heart disease is a cardiovascular disorder, and the major risk factor for heart disease is hypertension, which is just another way of saying high blood pressure. This can be caused by stressors including job strain, marital conflict, and natural disasters. It forces the heart to pump harder, thus putting increased physical strain on the heart. There are no symptoms, but this can lead to a heart attack, stroke, or heart failure, as well as kidney failure and blindness. Both heart disease and hypertension have also been linked to negative affectivity. Negative affectivity is the tendency to experience distressed emotional states involving anger, contempt, disgust, guilt, fear, and nervousness. So these are some of the symptoms of heart attacks. Look that over. Now, health psychologists also looked at type A and type B personalities. This contributed to question 3 in chapter 14. Friedman and Rosenman in 1974 discovered that people who are prone to heart disease tend to think, feel, and act differently than those who are not. They found that heart disease is over 7 times more frequently among type A personalities. So a type A personality tends to be extremely competitive, intensely driven, impatient, rushed, and hostile towards others, whereas a type B personality tends to be relaxed and laid back. Further research suggests that one of the most important factors in the development of heart disease is the anger-hostility dimension of the type A behavior pattern. Individuals that indicated that they responded to pressure with anger were over 6 times more likely than those who indicated less anger to have a heart attack by the age of 55. Question 3 is going to ask you about type A personality type and heart attack and the relationship between those two. Read the question carefully and read your textbook as well as this lecture to indicate your understanding. Now, health psychologists also looked at the transactional model of hostility for predicting social interactions. Now, if anger and hostility appear to constitute long-term risk factors for adverse cardiovascular outcomes, why? According to the transactional model of hostility for predicting social interactions, the thoughts and feelings of a hostile person promote antagonistic behavior towards others, which in turn reinforces complementary reactions from others, thereby intensifying one's hostile disposition and intensifying the cyclical nature of this relationship. So, we start with a hostile person's thoughts and feelings. Anger, mistrust, devalues others. That hostile person's behavior, hostile, confrontational, defensive, and aggression towards others, the recipient's response is surprise, avoidance, and defensiveness, which then creates a transactional cycle of reinforcement of the hostile person's behavior, meaning that person then devalues them for being avoiding and defensive. So it just creates this vicious cycle. If we then look at depression in the heart, so research suggests that a relationship exists between depression and heart disease as well. One reason for this seems to be that people diagnosed with depression as children have been found to be more likely to be obese, smoke, and physically inactive. Depression then may increase the likelihood of living an unhealthy lifestyle, and therefore the chance of heart disease is greater. So it's not that depression directly causes heart disease, it's more that the symptoms of depression, obesity, unfit lifestyle, that is what causes the heart disease. If we look at asthma, this is a chronic disease in which the airways become inflamed and narrowed, leading to difficulty breathing. The psychological factors play an important role in asthma. Studies show that some people with asthma will experience asthma-like symptoms if they expect to experience symptoms. So, for example, I have asthma in certain situations, sports-induced. I oftentimes will begin to experience difficulty breathing, even when I anticipate doing something that I know will potentially cause me asthma. People with asthma report and display a high level of negative emotions, so a lot more anxiety. Asthma attacks have been linked to periods of high emotionality, so if I become increasingly emotional, then I'm more likely to go into an asthma attack during those times. Exposure to stressful experiences has linked to the development of asthma through the lifespan, so the more stress I experience, the more likely over time, the more my asthma attacks will become more prevalent. This diagram shows you what's happening to the airways during an asthma attack. Now, coping. Lazarus and Folkman in 1984 created a problem-focused coping style, where the individual attempts to manage or alter the problem that is causing them to experience stress. So this involves identifying the problem, considering possible solutions, weighs the cost and benefits of these solutions, and then selects an alternative. Proactively addresses the problem, okay? And it's more likely to be used when the stressor is perceived as controllable. Can I control this stressor? Then I'm going to attack it head on. This is problem-focused coping. Emotion-focused coping efforts to change or reduce the negative emotions associated with the stress. So this can include avoiding, minimizing, or distancing oneself from the problem, or positive comparisons with others, or seeking emotional positive in a negative event. So this treats the symptoms of stress, but not the cause of stress. This is more often used for stressors we feel powerless to change. So for example, you're stressed because you're failing a class. The problem-focused approach is going to study more, contact a professor for help, and find a tutor. The emotion-focused approach is going to watch a movie or play a game and distract yourself from the problem. You're going to avoid just being faced with the fact that you're failing a class. I would ask, which do you think is better? Probably the problem-focused approach. Now, control and stress. The ability to enact control in our lives is a basic tenet of human behavior. Our reaction to potential stressors depends largely on how much control we feel we have. Perceived control is our beliefs about our personal capacity to exert influence over and shape outcomes. This has major implications for health and happiness. The greater personal control is associated with better physical and mental health, greater psychological well-being, and lower reactivity to stressors in daily life. Learned helplessness was created by Martin Seligman in 1967. This is an acquired belief that one is powerless to do anything about a situation. In Seligman's experiment, dogs were placed in a chamber where they received electric shocks from which they could not escape, meaning they were getting it from the floor. When they were later given the opportunity to escape the shocks, most seemed to give up and did not even try, which means that they had acquired learned helplessness. Seligman believed that learned helplessness to be a possible cause of depression. Once someone had reached that learned helplessness stage, they were very quickly going to reach a depressive state. Now, social support as it relates to stress is really critical. A fundamental human motive is the need to form and maintain strong, stable relationships. Social support is the soothing impact of friends, family, and acquaintances. This can include advice, guidance, encouragement, acceptance, emotional comfort, and tangible assistance. It provides comfort when faced with life stressors. A psychosocial factor affecting health outcomes. Individuals with stronger social relationships have a 50% greater likelihood of survival compared to those with weaker social relationships. And research suggests social support boosts the immune system and reduces your blood pressure. So stress and social support is really critical. And this will help you answer question 4 in this chapter. Some stress reduction techniques include exercise, relaxation response techniques, and biofeedback. Now, health psychologists do also study the pursuit of happiness. Some of the elements of happiness are pleasant life, meaning enjoying daily pleasures, a good life, using skills for enrichment, and meaningful life, contributing to the greater good. Happiness is an enduring state of subjective well-being consisting of joy, contentment, and other positive emotions, plus the sense that one's life has meaning and value. Now, the average person in the world tends to be relatively happy. A survey of residents in over 150 countries indicated that Denmark has the happiest citizens in the world. Americans ranked the United States as the 17th happiest country in which to live. So we're not quite up there yet, but hopefully soon. Now, the factors connected to happiness include age. Life satisfaction usually increases with age. So as the more you age, the more satisfied you are, which means the happier you can become. Family and social relationships. Married people report being happier than those that are not. High quality social relationships and strong social support networks correlate with increased happiness. Money, a nation's gross domestic product, or GDP, is associated with happiness levels. Wealthy individuals tend to be happier than poor individuals. However, happiness increases with income only up to $75,000. So all of these folks that have like billion-dollar incomes a year or three-figure salaries a year actually aren't happier than those that have a simple five-figure salary. Religion, in nations with difficult living conditions, religiosity is associated with greater well-being, but does not make a difference in nations with favorable living conditions. People that possess characteristics, values in their culture tend to be happy. So culture can also affect happiness. People are often poor at predicting the intensity and duration of their future emotions. Events may initially cause an intense surge of emotion, but we eventually adapt to changing emotional circumstances in our lives. Dramatic life events have much less long-lasting impact on happiness than might be expected. So in A, long-suffering Chicago Cubs fans could no doubt feel elated when their team won a World Series championship. And in B, in ways that are similar, those who play the lottery rightfully think that choosing the correct numbers and winning millions would lead to a surge in happiness. However, the initial burst of elation following such elusive events would most likely erode with time. This graph here shows satisfaction across several years before and after 3 significant life events. 0 represents the year that it happened. So despite the idea that life events do not permanently alter people's general levels of happiness, these findings suggest that long-term happiness levels can and do change for some people. So if you're looking at the blue line, that's marriage. So they're going on about their day, and then at year 0, that's when the marriage occurs, but their happiness level stays relatively similar to when they were not married. Death of a spouse, however, they have a very quick decline when the spouse dies, and then they slowly incline back up and do find some happiness, similar to where they began. And then unemployment. You can see that even after the unemployment stage, they don't tend to reach the same levels of happiness prior to when they were unemployed. This led to positive psychology. So Seligman, who created that learned helplessness in 1998, urged psychologists to focus more on understanding how to build human strength and psychological well-being. Thus laid the foundation for positive psychology, which seeks to identify and promote these qualities that led to greater fulfillment in our lives. So they study well-being, satisfaction, hope and optimism, happiness, capacity for love, courage, interpersonal skills, aesthetic sensibility, perseverance, forgiveness and compassion, originality, future-mindedness, spirituality, high talent, wisdom, a whole bunch of things that you can't even see on this slide because it's so much. They look at positive affect and optimism. These are qualities that help promote psychological well-being are linked with many favorable health outcomes. Positive affect is pleasurable engagement with the environment, such as happiness, joy, enthusiasm, alertness, and excitement. This is associated with greater social connectedness, emotional and practical support, adaptive coping efforts, lower depression, longevity, and favorable physiological functioning. Optimism is the general tendency to look on the bright side of things. Your glass is half full when you're optimistic. This is the tendency to expect that good things will happen, tendency to view life's stressors and difficulties as temporary and external to oneself. This is a significant predictor of positive health outcomes as well. And flow. Flow is a particular experience that is so engaging and engrossing that it has become worth doing for its own sake. This is the feeling of losing oneself in an activity, right? If you're in a flow, you're vibing. This is a state of effortless concentration and focus. Feels like time passes more quickly than usual. Usually related to creative endeavors and leisure activities. Experienced by people who like their job or students who love studying. Typically occurs when people engage in challenging activities that require skills and knowledge they know they possess. Thought to play a key role in happiness is flow. Excellent. That covers your chapters for this week. I integrated the questions into the lecture, so hopefully you should be all set there. If you have any questions that you need to discuss with me, please don't hesitate to reach out. via email at nwest@westfield.ma.edu. I am not super quick to check the messages in Plato, so please email me directly at nwest@westfield.ma.edu. Have a great week.